thank you for tuning in. I am going to show you how to make the best Brie or Camembert at home. Now there is only one ingredient difference between the two, so you can make whichever one you prefer. Now I'm not a professional cheesemaker, I'm a hobby cheesemaker, but my recipe really does work. It is tried, tested and perfected and will be the best Brie or Camembert that you will ever taste, though I do say it myself. Once you've tried this, there'll be no going back to that store-bought rubbish. And just when you're thinking this cannot get any better than it is already, I'm going to show you how to make this at home without any fancy equipment. So I hope you join me. Okay, this is some of my cheese making equipment. I don't have a massive range of cheese making equipment anyway, but I found that you really don't need as much as you think you need. I think it's really good to show people how to make some great cheese recipes with pretty much what you just have around the house. So you don't have to invest in lots and lots of equipment. You can do clearly if you want to and take the hobby further. You don't need a cheese press, and by the way I made that cheese press myself, because you don't need to press Brie. We're not even going to use the cheese mould, because what I'm going to use for this particular recipe is this, and that's actually just the inside of a salad spinner. Obviously I've got a cheese mould, I could use it, but there's really no point because I'm trying to show you how you can do this without any specialist equipment. So all we're really going to need for this is the stock pot, the mould, a few basic utensils. A thermometer is an absolute must, I have to say. That's probably the only thing, if you don't have it, that you'll have to buy. And we're going to need one of these, which the fancy term is a cheese ripening box. In reality, all that is, as you can see, is a Tupperware box. You're also going to need what they call a double boiler, which is a very, very fancy word for a pot underneath another pot. I'm just showing you this because I wanted to show you what you can get away with. That's just simply a mixing bowl, and that would be a pot underneath filled with water, because what you're trying to do is gently heat the milk. You don't want to scorch it, you don't want to burn it, which you would get through direct heat. Now, as long as you use something that is either glass, ceramic or stainless steel, don't use aluminium or aluminum for my American friends, because that will affect the milk. I'm actually not going to use this because it's not quite big enough for the quantities of this recipe. But I'm only pointing this out just to say that you don't have to have a lot of fancy equipment. If you have a glass ceramic bowl that's big enough, then you can get away with that. Well, this is what I'm going to use for today. That's my pot underneath, my double boiler. There's my stock pot. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put up the ingredients on the screen, and I'll leave that up for a few seconds so you can do a screen grab. And meanwhile, I'm going to sterilize all my equipment, and that is really important because we don't want any bad bacteria in the cheese. Okay, so let's get started. I've put the milk in the stock pot. This particular recipe calls for around 3.5 litres, roughly 7.5 pints US terms. Now, if you want to make Camembert, just stick with the milk. If you want to make Brie, and this is the fundamental difference between Brie and Camembert, add some cream, either double cream or heavy cream for my US friends. Now, one thing I wanted to talk to you about very briefly, the importance of the milk that you use. As with anything in life, what you put in, you get out. And the importance of the milk you use is exactly the same. The better quality milk you can use, the better quality cheese you're going to get. I am a real advocate of raw milk, and that's exactly what I'm using here. There are a lot of health benefits to raw milk. I have a separate video on raw milk if you're interested to find out a little bit more. But at the very least, just buy the best quality milk you possibly can. Ideally, if you can't get raw milk or you don't want to use raw milk, try and find unhomogenized milk. That is going to produce a better cheese for you. If you can't find unhomogenized milk, then, and you can only get the sort of regular store-bought milk, you are going to have to add calcium chloride to this recipe, because the homogenization process basically loses a lot of the calcium content of the milk. Now I used store-bought milk to start when I started making cheese, and I did that primarily because whilst I was experimenting, I didn't want to spend a lot of money on milk because raw milk is certainly, well, it is here anyway, a lot more expensive than the supermarket milk. But the good news is you don't have to worry about that. If you do have a supplier of good quality milk and it is going to cost a little bit more, please go ahead and do it, because the great thing is with this recipe is I have ironed out all the problems for you, and this really is a foolproof recipe. If I haven't mentioned it already, you are going to end up with the best tasting Brie or Camembert that you have ever tasted. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we need to bring the milk up to a target temperature of 90 degrees Fahrenheit, 32 degrees Celsius. Now, this needs to be done very gradually. What I do is I bring the pot underneath to the boil, and once it's at a boil I set it on a gentle simmer. Probably going to take 30 to 45 minutes if you do this gradually, allowing the milk to reach its temperature. And just gently stir the milk, not all the time but just periodically while the milk is reaching its target temperature. This is kind of ironic for me because I actually tend to be the sort of person that lives my life at 90 miles an hour. So cheese making isn't a natural fit, or you wouldn't think it would be. But I actually really enjoy cheese making. I mean, you do need an awful lot of patience with it. Not only in the making process, but with a lot of cheeses, you have to wait for them to mature. Great thing about Brie is you don't. I mean, this is a cheese you can eat fairly soon after you've made it. And that's another reason, actually, I've halved this recipe, because I've found it's just myself and my wife now. One wheel of cheese lasts us about 2 weeks, and that's fine. The normal recipe does 2 wheels of cheese. And I find that's actually a little bit too much for us because Brie doesn't keep that well. It tends to start going very soft, which I know is an ideal characteristic for Brie, but we personally like it a little firmer. So I just think it's nicer just to do 1 wheel at a time, and every couple of weeks we make ourselves some Brie, and we always have fresh Brie that way. Okay, so we have reached our target temperature of 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and what we're going to do now is add the starter cultures and the Penicillum Candidum. That's the penicillin is what gives the white bloom to Brie and Camembert. So it's probably a good idea at this point to take it off the boiler, because it's likely to, with the retained heat, it's going to get too hot. In fact, what I generally tend to do is I wait until we're about 5 degrees Fahrenheit away from the target temperature, and I take it off the boiler and just let it gradually reach that target temperature on its own. So what we're going to do now is add the starter culture, which is the Mesophilic 2. It's basically just a fairly regular direct set starter culture. Your local cheese supplier or your cheese supplier that you get it from will just be able to advise you which one to use. But as far as I'm concerned, a fairly basic mesophilic starter, direct set starter culture works really well with this recipe. And then we're going to add the Penicillum Candidum. Now what we're going to do with this is just allow this to rehydrate for about 3 or 4 minutes. Okay, once it's rehydrated after a few minutes, we're just going to gently stir all this through. And again, you want to stir this probably for no more than about a minute, just enough to give the cultures the opportunity to disperse properly throughout the milk. And just a quick thing on the measurements. This calls for 1/8 of a teaspoon of the mesophilic starter culture. And even a lot of people don't have measuring spoons that go down to 1/8. I find a lot of people just have a quarter. So if you do, just do your best at judging a quarter. And obviously with the penicillin, that's actually asking for a 1/16 of a teaspoon, which if you don't have a 1/8, then you're really not likely to have a 1/16 either. But again, just use your judgment. That's really a very, very good pinch of the powder between your thumb and finger. So I found, yeah, everyone says that cheese making is really accurate and precise science, and I'm sure it is for those that take it to that level. You can even get into, buying a pH meter and or pH papers and testing the acidity. That is not what I want to get out of this hobby. I just want to be able to make some really tasty cheese at home with ingredients that I know have gone into it. So I've found for that reason that the measurements, whilst you've got to be reasonably precise, they don't have to be precise where you're weighing it out on scientific scales or anything like that. So what we're going to do now is we're actually going to leave this to rest for 60 minutes. What you're going to need to do though is keep an eye on the temperature. Just check it every sort of 10 minutes or so. If you find it's getting a little too cool, put it back onto your double boiler. Try and maintain that 90° Fahrenheit, 32 degrees Celsius for the next hour. Okay, I'm just going to give this a little stir, very gentle stir, and check the temperature. Now, this thermometer I'm using isn't anything fancy. I got this from eBay. I think it was about $2.99 or $3.50 with free shipping. So again, you don't really have to spend a lot of money on your equipment. If you don't have that, then just use your regular thermometer and just check that it's obviously maintaining the correct temperature. And the temperatures are quite critical, so you don't want to allow this to go very much either side of your target temperature, in this case 90 degrees Fahrenheit, 32 degrees Celsius. Well, just giving this another little check, giving it a stir and checking the temperature. As I said, you need to do this about every 10 to 15 minutes while the cultures are doing their thing. I don't know if you guys read or heard about this, but apparently a tornado went through a cheese factory in France, and apparently all that was left was debris. Boom boom. There's my little Brie joke for you. Okay, another little check on everything. It's really not that bad at all, because apart from checking this every 10 or 15 minutes, you can get on with other things. So it's not really as time consuming as it might appear. Anyway, that's good. We're maintaining our temperature, so I'll be back with you shortly. Okay, we've left this an hour. Okay, all we need to do at this point now is add the rennet. I'm actually going to be using vegetable rennet. You can use animal. It really doesn't make animal rennet. Sorry. It really doesn't matter which you use. I found both are just as effective as the other. It's very important that you mix the quantity of rennet into some water, and the water you use is imperative. Do not use tap water or city water. Just use a bottle of spring water. You only need a little bit. Run about 1/8 to 1/4 of water and mix your rennet in with that. Now, if you are using store-bought milk, then this is the point you also need to add the calcium chloride. Obviously, if you're using unhomogenized milk or raw milk, you don't have to bother with the calcium chloride. So all we're going to do now is simply add that into the milk and cream, in this case, because we're making brie. Stir that through for about a minute. And then what we're going to do after that is leave it. We don't even have to check on, stirring it. In fact, we actually need to just leave this completely to allow the rennet to curdle the milk. It's actually how we get our curds, and it's how it sets. Now this will take anywhere between 45 minutes and 2 hours. I generally find about an hour is good enough. So what you'll do probably after about 45 minutes is come along and check it and see that the curds have set correctly. And when we come back to that part, I will show you what you're looking for. So it's just been an hour, and we're going to check and see if the milk has coagulated correctly. What we're going to do with this is just look for what they call a clean break. Use a knife, or in this case I've got a spatula, pop it in there and just twist it. And I hope you can see that was a nice clean break. You could always use your little pinky as well, as long as it's clean. But again, I hope you can see this. Yep. Just stick your finger in, lift it, and you can see that is a nice clean break. What we're going to do now is cut the curds. Now traditionally, from what I understand, they don't cut the curds when they're making brie, but I actually find it's quite useful to do that. So you're going to basically want to cut them roughly 1-inch squares. You can use a knife for this, you can use a spatula. I'm just going to use the spatula. Now we're just going to very, very gently stir these curds, and I mean very gently because at this point they are quite delicate and we don't want to break them down. We want to try and keep them around about the 1-inch cubes. So we're just going to stir this ever so gently, just to allow them to break up, just like that. In fact, you're not even stirring, just gradually pull your spoon through. And then what we're going to do is we're going to leave this for about 10 minutes. Just allow this to settle and get the curds to separate from the whey. Okay, so it's been about 10 minutes. As you can see, the curds have separated from the whey. And what you're looking for here, for the curds to be reasonably firm and springy, which is basically what we have here. So let's move on to the next part. Okay, so this is when we actually now ladle this into our mould. And as you can see, I've got my salad spinner, I've got a cake rack, and I've got a Tupperware box underneath because we want to keep all of the whey from this. Whey is a fantastic thing, proper natural whey, much better than the powdered stuff you buy in sports shops. This is the real deal. And it is so good for you, it is so full of goodness, and there's so many other uses for it. In fact, I've actually done a video on all the uses of whey, so please don't throw that away. Now at this point, I'm actually going to line this with a cheesecloth. This has been boiled, it's still a little bit hot. You don't have to use a cheesecloth, you could line this with a bit of baking paper. As you can see, there's some big holes and you don't want that to fall out. I'm actually using the cheesecloth because at a little point in the future we're going to have to turn this cheese over, and I just find it a little bit easier to get the curd mass out by pulling it out with the cheesecloth rather than trying to do it any other way. So again, I would recommend that. A cheesecloth isn't very expensive to buy. So let's get to it. I recommend ladling this in rather than trying to pour it in, because if you pour it, this is when you tend to damage the curds a lot because they fall from a bit of a height and they start breaking up. If you ladle it, you can try and preserve the shape of the curds as much as you can. Okay, we'll just let some of the whey fall out of that, drain through, so we can just put the final bit of curds in here. So I'll let that drain for a little while, then we'll add the rest of the curds. So it's been about 15 minutes. As you can see, the curds are starting to compress a little bit, so I can add the rest of my curds to that now. I have already drained off some of the whey from a Tupperware box. What we're going to do now is just simply leave this. It's probably going to take a couple of hours to allow enough whey to drain through this that we can even attempt to try and turn that cheese, or the curd mass. We do need to turn it fairly regularly, but as I said, I think you're going to have to leave it at least 2 to 3 hours before we even attempt to try and turn it, otherwise it's just going to fall apart. So, and the other thing, sorry, is you need to make sure that at this point your work environment is around about sort of 70 degrees Fahrenheit, just a nice comfortable room temperature. Righty ho, it's now been about 2 hours, and as you can see, the curds have dropped to pretty much halfway down this mould, so we've got rid of a lot of the whey. I've actually bottled up about 2.5 bottles, so that's roughly 2.5 litres. The whey will still continue to come out, but we're now at the point where I've got to attempt the very first turning of the cheese. This is without doubt going to be the hardest one because the curds are still haven't really formed properly. The more we do this and the more time progresses, the curds will expel more whey and become a little firmer and easier to handle. So I also hope you can see now the benefit of using the cheesecloth, because it's going to make this so much easier getting out the cheese mould. So I'm going to shut up now, which I'm sure you're very pleased about, and focus on seeing if I can just turn the cheese successfully without breaking it. That wasn't bad, we did it, and like I said, I've done a lot of practice on that, and I find it very much the easiest way of turning the cheese. As I said, it will get easier. We don't need the cheesecloth now because we're going to leave this about another hour and it will have compressed even more, and each time, as I said, it's just going to get easier and easier to handle. Okay, it's been about another hour since I did the first turning of the cheese, and this certainly does look as though it's compacting very nicely. Now when you go and buy your Tupperware box for the ripening of the cheese, I mean, obviously make sure it's going to be big enough to fit the cheese first of all. I'm not sure if I mentioned this is very roughly an 8-inch diameter basket, and that's the sort of size you need for this recipe. But yeah, if you can buy the Tupperware that has the drip tray in it, not only is this going to be extremely useful when you're ripening this, because you're going to have to drain it very regularly. You do not want the cheese wheel sitting in the way. It's going to have to be emptied very, very regularly, and that can coincide when you turn it very regularly. The other advantage to this little cheese mat is it helps with the flipping process, as I'm just about to show you. Yay, we did it! Another successful turning of the cheese. Now we're going to have to do this probably for about the next 16 to 24 hours, and also we're going to need to drain as much whey as we can before we salt this cheese. So I'm not going to keep showing you the flipping, just basically keep flipping this for the next 16, possibly up to 24 hours. I know you're not going to do it every hour because you're going to be asleep at some point, but just do it as regularly as you can. And I'm actually going to transfer this to the ripening box now. It's not actually at the ripening stage, but it's just going to take up a little less room. And as I say, every time you come along to turn this, just make sure you drain out the whey in the Tupperware box. Try and keep it, don't throw it down the sink. Just add it to any whey you've already kept. And just the important thing is just make sure that it's not sitting in its own whey. So I'll catch you in about 16 to 24 hours, and we'll then salt this and go on to the ripening stage. Okay, so now we're ready for the salting of the cheese. This has actually taken about 36 hours for the whey to drain out. You'll probably find that it still will start draining a little bit more, but as you can see, this has compressed very nicely, about 1 inch thick. Yeah, and it's looking pretty good. And I think you can also see now this has got a lot easier to handle. So we're not really going to need the cheese mold anymore, so that can get washed. And what we're going to do now is salt this. So a little word on the salt. You can use cheese salt, but it tends to be a lot more expensive. It's perfectly fine to use either kosher salt or natural sea salt. Do not use table salt or salt that has been iodized. It's imperative that you use non-iodized salt. And again, I'm using sea salt here. Try and get the flake salt if you can, because it dissolves much easier. Do not try and use the rock salt. Okay, this is going to require roughly 2 tablespoons. The important thing is just to make sure that the salt covers the cheese completely. I tend to use this method. Just put some salt on a plate, put that on there, sprinkle some more on here, and just rub it in. Make sure that you do cover the cheese completely with salt, and just spend a little bit of time rubbing it in, because if this isn't covered completely, you'll find that the white bloom is probably going to be a little patchy. So just going to spend some time just making sure that this is well covered. And the other thing I tend to do, just to get the edges, which is why I put some on the plate, is just roll it through like that. So just spend a little bit of time making sure that that is all nicely rubbed in on both sides. I find it a little useful just to use a pastry brush here, moistened pastry brush, just to make sure that the salt is nice and evenly distributed. When you moisten it, just make sure you use spring water, don't use tap water or city water. Okay, so that's about all there is to it at this stage. It's all been nicely salted. What we now need to do, as you can see, we don't need the cheese mold anymore. The cheese is holding together very nicely. So we've popped it in the ripening box. Make sure you have something that has a drip tray underneath, because there is still a little bit of whey that will come out. And also you need to keep this at a fairly high humidity, around about 90% humidity. If you don't have a meter for that, just use your judgment. Put a little pot of water in the Tupperware box. Make sure that it's reasonably humid, but do not let it get to the point where it is wet. That's not what we want, or water's dripping off, you know, the lid onto the cheese. So we're going to turn the cheese daily. Just do one turn once a day. Check there's no whey in the bottom, because we don't want the cheese sitting in that. Make sure it's not too moist in there. We just need it humid. And temperature, what we're looking for is around about 55 degrees Fahrenheit, 13 degrees Celsius. A wine cooler is generally perfect for that. If not, try and find an area of your house that is a fairly constant 55 degrees Fahrenheit, but keep it away from any direct sunlight. And what's going to happen now is, over the next 7 to 10 days, the white mold, the bloom, which is the characteristic of Camembert and Brie, will start to form. So I'm going to come back to you as soon as this has started forming its white mold. Sorry, just one other point. Do not seal the container. You do need some air circulation, so just loosely put your top on, slightly askew, so there is some opportunity for air to get in there. If you seal it, it's probably going to get way too humid. The cheese is going to go all slimy, and that's not good. So that's about it for the moment. We'll just wait and see when the white mold develops, and I will show you that as it develops. Okay, it's been 9 days now since I made the Brie cheese, and we're going to take a look at it so I can show you the mold development. If I haven't mentioned it already, don't forget to wash your hands with the white vinegar solution before you handle the cheese on every occasion. So I'm just going to do that quickly. Okay, as you can see, I've kept a little pot in mine filled with water just to keep the humidity up. It does need to be quite high at about 90 to 95% humidity. So here is the cheese, and hopefully yours is looking something like this. It's not quite covered, but it's almost there. Another couple of days and this should be completely covered in the white bloom, and then we're ready to wrap it and ripen it. So I hope you've been turning your cheese every day, because that is very, very important, and keeping the humidity up. So we'll come back to you in a couple of days and hopefully ready to wrap and ripen this. Well, hello again. It's now been 14 days since we made the Brie, and I've been turning it every day, which I hope you have too. And as you can see, it's now covered really well with the white mold, the white bloom. So this is really just about ready to wrap. I'm actually going to go ahead and wrap this now. It's got a couple of little patches that could, maybe if you left it another couple of days, but for the purposes of making the video, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this now. So you can either use Brie wrap or parchment paper or baking paper. When you do order your Brie wrap, don't do what I just did and order the wrong size. This is 10 inch by 10 inch, so it's really designed for very small wheels of Brie. But I'm actually going to use both because I've got these and they're slightly more waxy than the baking paper. It doesn't make a difference, but whatever you do, do not wrap this in cling film because the cheese needs to breathe. So I'm just going to go ahead and get this wrapped. The wrapping isn't brilliant, I know, but to be honest, this is just so it matures and we can get into eating it as soon as we can. Now what you're going to do now is put this in the regular refrigerator. It's going to take between 2 to 3 weeks to mature, and you need to just turn it once a day. And that's it, simple as that. And then I'll be back with you in a couple of weeks and we will try this brie. Okay, so now it's time to taste the cheese. That's looking pretty good, I think. Now I'm going to take this outside because it's a lovely sunny day, and we're now going to try this and see how it tastes. So let's get stuck in. Now that has a lovely texture. This has come straight out the fridge, so ideally we would need to leave this 10 or 15 minutes. But I actually prefer mine like this. It's personal choice. So now let's taste it. Oh man, that is so good. It's so creamy. This recipe honestly never ever fails. So I hope you give this a try. If you have any questions, please leave them and I'll get back to each and every one of you. But do give this a try. It is simply a foolproof brie or camembert recipe, and happy cheese making.